Among the tribes of Israel, there was a respected man named Kis, from the tribe of Benjamin. His son, Saul, was a notable figure among the Israelites, a tall and handsome young man who attracted attention wherever he went. One day, some of Kish's donkeys got lost, and Saul was sent along with a servant to look for them. The search took them to various regions, but the animals were not found. When Saul was considering returning home, fearing that his father would be worried, his servant suggested seeking out a man of God in a nearby city. In those days, prophets were called seers, and this man was respected because everything he said came true. Upon arriving in the city, they asked the young women returning from the well if the seer was there. They confirmed that this was the case and instructed Saul to hurry, for he was to participate in a sacrifice. Saul and his servant went on ahead, and before they could even catch up with him, Samuel, the prophet of the Lord, was already waiting for them. God had spoken to Samuel the previous day, revealing that a man from the tribe of Benjamin would come to him and that this man should be anointed as prince over Israel. As soon as God saw Saul, he confirmed it to the prophet. That was the chosen one. Without Saul knowing what was about to happen, Samuel received him with honor. He led him to the altar, gave him a place of honor among the guests, and served him a special cut of meat that had been reserved for him. After the meal, Samuel prepared a place for Saul to spend the night. At dawn, he summoned him and asked him to send his servant ahead, for he needed to deliver a divine message to him. When they were alone, Samuel took a flask of oil and anointed Saul's head, saying, "The Lord anointed him as prince over his inheritance." Samuel then prophesied 3 signs that would confirm Saul's choice. First, as he approached his homeland, he would meet 2 men who would tell him that the lost donkeys had been found and that his father was now concerned about him. Then, as he went to the oak of Tabor, he would meet 3 men on the way to Bethel, who would give him 2 loaves of bread. Finally, in Gibeah, a group of prophets would descend from the mountain playing instruments and prophesying, and at that moment the Spirit of the Lord would come upon Saul, transforming him into a new man. Everything happened according to the prophet's word. As soon as Saul met the prophets, the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he began to prophesy among them. The people who knew him were astonished to see him in that condition and murmured, "What happened to Kis's son? Is Saul also among the prophets?" This event caused astonishment among the Israelites and gave rise to a popular saying that spread rapidly among the people. Saul returned home without telling anyone about his anointing. Even when his uncle asked what Samuel had told him, Saul simply replied that the donkeys had been found. He did not yet fully comprehend the magnitude of his mission, but the time would soon come for him to present himself to the people and assume the role that God had assigned him. The people of Israel were crying out for a king, desiring to be like other nations, even after God had warned about the consequences of that decision. The Lord answered their request and instructed Samuel to gather the tribes to present the chosen one. In Mizpah, Samuel summoned the Israelites and proclaimed the word of the Lord, reminding them how God had delivered them from Egypt and freed them from their enemies. But even so, they had rejected his divine rule, demanding a human king. To show the people who was chosen, Samuel cast lots among the tribes of Israel. The lot fell on the tribe of Benjamin, then on the family of Matri, and finally on Saul, son of Kish. However, when they went to look for him, he was not among those present. The Lord then revealed that Saul was hiding among the baggage. The men ran over there and brought him into the middle of the congregation. When Saul stood up, he was taller than all the others, and Samuel declared, "Look at the man the Lord has chosen, there is no one like him among all the people." The excited crowd shouted in unison, "Long live the king!" Samuel then explained the laws of the kingdom to the people and recorded everything in a book before the Lord. Then he sent everyone back to their homes. Saul also returned to Gibeah, accompanied by valiant men whose hearts God had touched. However, not everyone was satisfied with God's choice. Some wicked men mocked him, saying, "Can this man save us? Zerenia, refusing to acknowledge him and honor him with gifts. Even so, Saul ignored the criticism and remained silent. Some time later, the first major test of his leadership emerged. Naz, king of the Ammonites, besieged the city of Jabez Gilead and made a cruel proposal. He would only spare the inhabitants if he gouged out their right eye, bringing humiliation to all of Israel. The elders of Jabez asked for 7 days to seek help. If no one came to their aid, they would surrender the city. The messengers went to Saul and reported the threat. When the king heard the news, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him, and his anger burned. Saul took a yoke of oxen, cut them into pieces, and sent them throughout all Israel with a stern warning. This is what will happen to the cattle of those who do not follow Saul and Samuel. The fear of the Lord fell upon the people, and 330,000 men gathered for battle. Saul sent a message to the inhabitants of Jabesh, assuring them that they would be freed the following day. At dawn, he divided the army into 3 companies and attacked the Ammonites by surprise. The enemy army was completely destroyed, and the survivors fled in all directions. After the victory, the people turned against those who had despised Saul and suggested that they be executed. However, Saul showed mercy and declared, "No one will be killed today, for the Lord has brought deliverance to Israel." Next, Samuel summoned the people to Gilgal, where Saul's reign was officially confirmed. There, before the Lord, they offered sacrifices and celebrated with great joy, acknowledging Saul as their king. The coronation was marked by jubilation, but also by a solemn warning from Samuel. If the people and their king obeyed the Lord, they would live in peace, but if they strayed, they would face the same consequences as their ancestors. With that, Saul's fate was sealed. His reign began in glory, but obedience to the Lord would be the true test of his greatness. Saul's reign seemed promising. He had earned the respect of the people and demonstrated leadership in the war against the Ammonites. However, he would soon face a test that would reveal his impatience and disobedience to God. The Philistines, historical enemies of Israel, assembled an overwhelming army to wage war against the Hebrews. His army possessed thousands of chariots and cavalry, as well as an infantry so numerous it resembled the sand of the sea. Faced with this threat, the Israelites were terrified, and many fled, hiding in caves, wells, and cisterns. Saul remained in Gilgal, where he awaited Samuel, for the prophet had instructed him to wait 7 days before offering a sacrifice to the Lord. This act was not merely ceremonial, but represented Israel's dependence on God for victory. However, as the days passed and Samuel did not arrive, Saul's anxiety grew. His soldiers began to desert, and fearing the complete loss of his army, he made a rash decision. Without being a priest and without divine permission, Saul offered the sacrifice on his own initiative. As soon as he finished, Samuel arrived. Seeing the king before the altar, the prophet asked firmly, "What have you done?" Saul tried to justify himself, claiming that the people were fleeing and that the Philistines were about to attack. So he decided to take action and seek the Lord's help. But Samuel didn't accept the excuse. He declared, "You made a big mistake. If he had obeyed, the Lord would have established his reign forever, but now his kingdom will not endure. The Lord has already chosen a man after his own heart to be leader over Israel." Saul could have trusted in the Lord and waited for the prophet to arrive, but he chose to act according to his own logic and fear. This act of disobedience revealed his lack of trust in God and his tendency to seek human solutions instead of following divine guidance. Even if he continued as king for many more years, at that point it became clear that his reign would not have a lasting legacy. After Samuel left, Saul counted his men and realized that only 600 soldiers remained with him. Furthermore, Israel was in a critical situation. The Philistines had taken control of weapons production and did not allow the Hebrews to have blacksmiths, so only Saul and his son Jonathan possessed swords. Even so, Saul remained on the battlefield, unaware that his own son would soon take an unexpected action that would change the course of the conflict. While Saul remained hesitant, his son Jonathan made a bold decision. Without informing his father, he summoned his squire and proposed a risky plan. "Let's go to the Philistine garrison. Perhaps the Lord will help us, for to him there is no difference between saving with many or with few." Jonathan fully trusted that God could grant victory, even with reduced strength. His loyal squire promptly replied, "Do whatever you think is best, I'm with you." The two climbed a steep ravine until they reached the Philistine outpost. When they were spotted, the enemy soldiers mocked them, saying, "Come here, let's teach these Hebrews a lesson." But at that moment, Jonathan interpreted it as a sign from God. Courageously, he and his squire attacked the outpost and killed about 20 enemies in a small area of land. This triggered widespread panic in the Philistine camp. In the distance, Saul's sentinels noticed a great commotion among the Philistines. The enemy army was in disarray, attacking each other without understanding what was happening. Saul ordered a head count of his soldiers and realized that Jonathan and his armor-bearer were missing. He then asked the priest to consult God, but before he could receive an answer, he saw that the chaos among the Philistines was only increasing. He then decided to act immediately and ordered the army to advance against the enemies. The attack was a success. The Hebrews who had deserted or hidden joined the battle, and the Philistine army retreated completely. However, in the midst of this victory, Saul made one more serious mistake. He made a rash oath, ordering that no one should start anything until the Philistines were completely defeated. His exhausted army had to fight all day without food, which weakened them even further. Unaware of his father's oath, Jonathan found a honeycomb on the ground and ate it. His eyes shone with vigor, and he felt invigorated. When informed of Saul's order, he replied, "My father has caused great trouble for the people. If we had eaten today, we would have completely defeated the Philistines." Saul's recklessness resulted in an incomplete victory, as the Philistines managed to escape and survive. Later, Saul consulted the Lord to find out if he should continue pursuing the Philistines. But God did not answer. The king realized something was wrong and cast lots to find out who had broken their oath. The result pointed to Jonadab, who admitted to eating the honey. Saul then declared that he should die. But the soldiers intervened, saying, "Jonathan brought victory today, he cannot die." The people rescued Jonathan, and Saul gave up pursuing the Philistines. This episode revealed a worrying trait in Saul's leadership. He made impulsive decisions without considering the consequences. The weight of his choices fell upon his own men, and now it was beginning to distance him further and further from divine favor. Saul continued his reign, expanding the borders of Israel and winning several battles against the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, and Philistines. However, the time came when God would test him again. Samuel brought the king a direct order from the Lord. "Go and utterly destroy the Amalekites. Spare no one. Exterminate men, women, children, and even animals." This sentence was a divine judgment upon a people who, since their exodus from Egypt, had been enemies of Israel and constantly oppressed God's people. Saul gathered his army and marched against the Amalekites, winning a crushing victory. However, instead of fully obeying the Lord's command, he and his soldiers spared King Agag and kept the best animals for themselves. They justified their actions by saying that these animals could be offered as a sacrifice to the Lord, but in reality, they were driven by self-interest. This decision showed that Saul valued his own logic more than unwavering obedience to God. That night the Lord spoke to Samuel, "I regret that I made Saul king, for he has disobeyed me and has not carried out my commands." The prophet spent the night crying out to God, distressed by the situation. In the morning, he set out to meet Saul, but received disturbing news. The king had erected a monument in his own honor, demonstrating arrogance instead of humility. When Saul saw Samuel, he greeted him enthusiastically, saying, "Blessed be the Lord. Do what the Lord has commanded you." But Samuel was not fooled and questioned him. "So why do I hear the bleating of sheep and the lowing of cattle?" Saul tried to justify himself, saying that the people had spared the best animals to offer as sacrifices, but Samuel interrupted him sternly. Does the Lord delight in sacrifice as much as in obedience? Obedience is better than sacrifice. Faced with this reprimand, Saul finally confessed. "I have sinned, for I feared the people and obeyed their voice." However, the consequence of his disobedience had already been determined. Samuel declared, "The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you and given it to someone better than you." Upon hearing this, Saul grabbed the hem of the prophet's robe, and the fabric tore. Then Samuel said, "So also the Lord has torn the kingdom from you." Even after that, Saul pleaded with Samuel to accompany him before the people to maintain his honor. Samuel agreed, but before leaving, he demanded that Hagag, the king of the Amalekites, be brought before him. The prisoner arrived confident, thinking he would escape. But Samuel declared, "Just as his sword caused mothers to lose their sons, so too will his mother be childless." And he dashed it in pieces before the Lord. After that episode, Samuel never saw Saul again, but he deeply regretted his loss. The king would still hold the throne for many years, but from that day on, God was no longer with him. The Spirit of the Lord departed, a tormenting spirit came to afflict him. God's chosen one was now someone else, and soon his presence would begin to shine among the children of Israel. After his rejection as king, Saul began to suffer the spiritual consequences of his disobedience. The Spirit of the Lord departed from him, and an evil spirit came in his place and tormented him. His mind grew restless, his moods fluctuated between anger and despair, and he lost the peace he once possessed. When the prophet Samuel received the divine command to anoint a new king in Israel, the mission seemed impossible. Saul, still on the throne, represented a danger, and Samuel feared for his own life. However, obedient to the voice of the Lord, he set out for Bethlehem, carrying with him a jar of oil, a symbol of divine choice. Upon arriving at Jesse's house, Samuel found the patriarch's sons lined up before him, each possessing impressive attributes in human eyes. But God warned the prophet. Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. 1 Samuel 16:7. The first to present himself was Eliab, tall and imposing. Samuel almost acted rashly, judging by appearances, but God corrected him. One by one, Abinadab, Shammah, and the other sons passed before the prophet, and none of them received divine confirmation. The atmosphere of expectation gave way to bewilderment. How could it be that, among all those strong men, none was chosen by the Lord? Samuel then asked Jesse if there were any other children, receiving an almost nonchalant reply. The youngest son, who was in the field tending the sheep, was summoned, and what was revealed to them was surprising. David, with his healthy appearance, bright eyes, and pleasant bearing, carried within him something that transcended any physical attribute, a heart attuned to the will of God. The moment David appeared, the Lord said to Samuel, "This is it. Get up and anoint him." 1 Samuel 16:12. The prophet, obeying, poured the oil on the young man's head in the presence of his brothers. From that moment on, the Spirit of the Lord came upon David completely. While David was secretly being exalted by heaven, Saul was experiencing the beginning of his downfall. The Spirit of God departed from him, and a tormenting spirit took its place, plunging the king into deep anguish and imbalance. The royal court, seeking relief for the monarch, suggested finding someone skilled in the harp, capable of easing Saul's torment. It wasn't long before the name David came up, the young shepherd, already known for his courage, eloquence, good looks and, above all, for the presence of the Lord in his life. Summoned to court, David appeared before Saul and quickly won the king's favor. Playing his harp with skill and grace, the young man was able, for moments, to alleviate the burden that the evil spirit cast upon the monarch. Without yet fully knowing his destiny, David humbly served in the palace, while the hand of God discreetly shaped his future. He wasn't just a musician who emerged from there, he was chosen to restore the dignity of Israel's leadership. David's presence alongside Saul marked the beginning of a relationship filled with tension and silent prophecy. Each note played by David seemed to echo in the spiritual chambers of the kingdom, announcing the coming of a new era. The young man, shaped by the anonymity of the fields, now stood before the power of humanity and its corruptions. The story, however, was only beginning to be shaped by the invisible hands of the Almighty. And the courage that burned in David's heart would soon be put to the test before all the people. The stage was set for a battle that would transcend the limits of physical warfare and become a spiritual turning point for Israel. The Philistines, traditional enemies of the Hebrews, stood menacingly in the valley of Elah, led by a giant of astonishing proportions, Goliath of Gath. Standing nearly 3 meters tall, armed with heavy armor and a spear that resembled the beam of a loom, Goliath challenged the Israelites every morning and every evening, striking terror into Saul's entire army. No man dared to accept the duel, for whoever lost would drag his entire people into slavery. While fear paralyzed the soldiers of Israel, David, still a young man, had been sent by his father Jesse simply to bring provisions to his brothers on the battlefield. Upon arriving and hearing the giant's insolent challenge, a righteous indignation ignited in his heart. It was not merely a military affront, it was a direct offense against the living God of Israel. David, unable to tolerate such blasphemy, began to question the soldiers about the reward promised to whoever defeated the Philistine. His boldness caused discomfort, especially in his brother Eliab, who accused him of presumption. But David firmly ignored the criticism and persisted. Brought before King Saul, David did not back down. The monarch, impressed by the young man's courage, tried to dissuade him, highlighting the difference in experience between himself and the giant. However, David recounted his exploits as a shepherd, how he had faced and killed lions and bears to protect his flock. His confidence was not in human weapons, but in the faithfulness of the Lord, who had delivered him in previous battles. The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. 1 Samuel 17:37 declared with conviction, obtaining Saul's permission. Refusing the heavy armor offered by the king, David trusted in the weapons he knew. His staff, his sling, 5 smooth stones chosen from the stream. As they advanced to face Goliath, the contrast was stark. On one side, the colossus clad in iron and arrogance. On the other side, a young man dressed simply, but clothed in the courage that only true faith grants. Goliath mocked David, cursing him by his gods and vowing to feed his flesh to the vultures. But David responded with words that would echo forever. You come against me with sword, spear, and shield, but I come against you in the name of the Lord of hosts. 1 Samuel 17:45. Without hesitation, David ran to meet the giant. With skill honed by days in the fields, he swung his sling and launched a precise stone that lodged in Goliath's forehead, knocking him to the ground. In a swift movement, David ran, took the giant's own sword, and beheaded him before the astonished armies. The victory was swift and unexpected, spreading panic among the Philistines, who fled in disarray, pursued by the Israelites. David's name, previously unknown outside the fields, was now proclaimed throughout Israel as a hero and defender of the Lord's honor. This victory, however, was not merely a military feat. It was public confirmation that God was with David. Every stone thrown and every word proclaimed in that battle sealed the authenticity of his anointing. The Spirit of the Lord, which had come upon him on the day of his secret anointing, was now manifested before the whole nation. However, while David was winning the admiration of the people, a new seed began to germinate in Saul's heart, jealousy, which would soon become a bitter obsession. David's triumph over Goliath triggered a wave of popular acclaim that quickly spread throughout Israel. The young shepherd, now celebrated as the great liberator of the people, became a central figure in Saul's court. Women went out into the streets singing and dancing. Saul killed his 1,000, but David killed his tens of 1,000. 1 Samuel 18:7. These words, while praising the bravery of both, deeply wounded the king's pride. The people's joy contrasted sharply with the silent growth of bitterness germinating in Saul's heart. A shadow that, little by little, would consume his sanity. From that day on, Saul never looked at David the same way again. While he previously saw him as a talented and promising young musician, he now perceived him as a real threat to his throne. Envy had taken root so deeply that, in moments of torment, Saul was unable to control his violent impulses. Twice, in fits of rage, he hurled his spear at David while the young man played his harp to calm him down. On both occasions, David miraculously escaped, protected by the invisible hand of the Lord who had already chosen him. With the increasing tension, Saul decided to remove David from daily life, appointing him commander of 1,000 men and sending him to battles. It was a disguised strategy. Saul hoped that David would die at the hands of his enemies, without having to directly stain them with blood. However, God was with David in every battle. Victories piled up and popular favor grew even stronger. Realizing that indirect methods would not work, Saul devised a new plan. He offered his daughter Micaiah's hand in marriage to David as a trap. To win her over, David would have to bring back the foreskins of 100 Philistines, a feat that would put him in extreme danger. Once again, the plan failed. David not only met the challenge, but he did so boldly, bringing back twice the amount required. Her bravery not only secured her marriage to Michal, but also further highlighted divine protection over her life, once again thwarting the king's plans. The friendship between David and Jonathan, Saul's son, also flourished during this period. Jonathan, recognizing God's hand upon David, swore loyalty to his friend in a covenant of souls that transcended even royal lineage. Even knowing that the throne of Israel should, humanly speaking, be his by right of inheritance, Jonathan submitted to the Lord's will, loving David as himself. Such a friendship, sealed in a covenant before the Lord, would be a source of strength for David in the darkest days that were approaching. It wasn't long before Saul, desperate and spiritually weakened, made a fatal decision. He ordered his men, and even his own son, to kill David. Jonathan, true to his covenant of friendship, risked his own life to warn David of the imminent danger. David then began a harrowing escape that would lead him to deserts, caves, and hiding places. Saul's house, once a refuge for the young man, had become hostile territory. David's journey ceased to be a simple heroic ascent and became a true journey of faith and survival. Relentlessly pursued by Saul, David was forced to abandon the safety of the court and embark on a life of flight. Without resources or formal support, he initially took refuge in the sanctuary of Nob, where he sought help from the priest Amalek. There, in desperate circumstances, he received the consecrated bread and Goliath's sword, the silent trophy of his first great victory. Every gesture, every provision received, seemed to reinforce the destiny that hung over David, an anointed one of God, now walking through the valleys of uncertainty, protected only by the divine promise. Knowing that his movements were being watched, David set out for Gath, a Philistine city ruled by Achish. However, he found no refuge there either. Recognized by the king's servants as the young man who had defeated Goliath, David had to feign madness to preserve his life. Foaming at the mouth and scratching at the city gates, he degraded his own image to escape death. It was the beginning of a long journey where cunning, humility, and faith in God would be his main weapons against internal and external enemies. Retreating to the cave of Adullam, David found a new kind of covenant. There, all those who were in difficulty, in debt, or unhappy began to gather around him. Men rejected by society, lacking prestige or position, saw in David not only a military leader, but a spiritual guide capable of restoring their hope. It was in this dark shelter that the embryo of the army that would later sustain the kingdom of Israel under David's leadership was formed. Around 400 men swore allegiance to him, and with them, the young pastor began to shape a new vision for God's people. Even while fleeing, David did not abandon his principles. Driven by honor and compassion, he sought to ensure the safety of his elderly parents, entrusting them to the protection of the king of Moab. This gesture reveals the caring and faithful spirit that guided his decisions, even in the most difficult times. He was not just a warrior rising from the shadows. He was a man after God's own heart, attentive to his responsibilities and always ready to protect those he loved. Guided by the word of the prophet Gad, David understood that he should not remain hidden in foreign territory. He then returned to the land of Judah, even knowing that this exponentially increased the risk of being captured. Unwavering obedience to divine guidance was one of the most visible marks of his journey. David was not looking for shortcuts to his protection. He trusted that the same God who had anointed him would sustain him through the most severe trials. Meanwhile, Saul, consumed by paranoia and rage, committed increasingly heinous crimes in an attempt to capture his former servant. The massacre of the priests of Nob, perpetrated by Doeg the Edomite, at the behest of Saul, stained the history of Israel with innocent blood. This brutal episode, far from strengthening Saul's reign, revealed to the people and to David's men the depth of the corruption that consumed the king's heart. In contrast, David comforted and welcomed those who suffered, unknowingly strengthening the bonds of a future reign of justice. Each day of flight forged in David an unusual spiritual resilience. It wasn't just physical survival that was at stake, it was the shaping of a king's character, one who would learn to depend completely on God before wielding the scepter of Israel. The deserts, caves, and ambushes would not be the end of their story, but merely the prelude to the rise of the greatest king Israel would ever know. And amidst the dust of the trails and the silence of the starry nights, David's heart beat strong, in perfect harmony with the heart of the Most High. Taking refuge in caves and deserts, David found himself, on more than one occasion, faced with unexpected opportunities to forcibly change his destiny. One such situation occurred when Saul, in pursuit, entered alone into the same cave where David and his men were hiding. To anyone else, that moment would be seen as a clear sign of divine providence. His soldiers, whispering around him, insisted that the Lord had delivered Saul into their hands. However, David, guided by higher principles, recognized something that few understood at that time. It was not for man to touch the Lord's anointed. Instead of killing Saul, David approached silently and cut off the hem of the royal robe. Even this small gesture caused him deep remorse, revealing the delicate nature of his conscience before God. When Saul left the cave, David called to him from a distance, showed him the severed part of his robe, and bowed down in reverence. In words laden with honor and submission, David declared that he would never raise his hand against him, leaving judgment and vengeance in the hands of the Lord. The king, overcome with emotion, wept and publicly acknowledged David's righteousness, admitting that he would indeed be the future king of Israel. This display of mercy cemented David's reputation as a man of rare character. While the leaders of the surrounding nations ruled by force and treachery, David stood out for his reverence for divine will. He understood that the throne of Israel would not be conquered by violence, but would be granted by God himself in due time. This patience, this trusting surrender to the divine plan, made David more and more like the heart of the Most High, preparing him for a government founded on justice and mercy. After this episode, David continued his wandering life, moving from region to region, avoiding capture. But the relationship with Saul, although temporarily peaceful, remained fragile. The king's envy, fear, and spiritual instability soon reignited his murderous rage. David, however, did not allow bitterness to contaminate his spirit. With each new day of trial, his heart was molded to reign not only over men, but under the absolute authority of the God of Israel. A second major test came when David and Abishai raided Saul's camp during the night. They found the king asleep with his spear stuck in the ground next to his head. It was the perfect opportunity. No one would see them, and everything seemed to be at their feet. But once again David restrained his men. He did not allow Abishai to thrust the spear into Saul, reaffirming that no one should touch the Lord's anointed. Instead, he took the king's spear and water jug and, from a safe distance, called Saul to witness +1 proof of his loyalty. Upon seeing the objects in David's hands and hearing his words, Saul was once again moved and confessed his sin. But despite the momentary recognition, Saul and David knew that the persecution would not cease completely. Saul's heart was divided, and the uncertainty of his feelings made him an unpredictable enemy. David, however, remained firm in his purpose. He would not usurp the crown by force, but would patiently wait for the Lord's perfect timing, sustained only by unwavering trust in God. These events not only preserved David's life, but also strengthened the perception of Israel and its tribes about who should truly lead them. It was evident that a new type of king was emerging, not one who imposed himself through human power, but one who ruled through submission to the Almighty. And while night still shrouded Israel's future in uncertainty, a silent dawn began to break in the figure of the young shepherd from Bethlehem, who, even without a crown, already reigned in hearts. Amid the constant tension between Israel and the Philistines, Saul's fate was finally drawing to a tragic close. Spiritually weakened, without the Lord's guidance, and consumed by his own fears, Saul prepared for battle on Mount Gilboa. However, unlike the glorious times at the beginning of his reign, he now marched without divine protection. The absence of answers from God, neither through dreams nor prophets, led Saul to commit his final mistake. Seeking out the medium of Endor, in the desperate hope of receiving some guidance through the invocation of Samuel's spirit. The prophet's vision, even through the forbidden practice, delivered a harsh and unavoidable message. Samuel, already in the rest of the righteous, offered no relief. He declared that God had become Saul's enemy and that the next day both he and his sons would be dead. Weakened and terrified, Saul fell to the ground. The approaching battle would not only mark the end of his reign, but the culmination of all his disobedience and a definitive break between him and the Lord's favor. The king, who had once been chosen to guide Israel, now walked alone toward his own destruction. The battle was fierce and bloody. The Philistines attacked furiously, and the demoralized Israelite troops began to fall. Saul's sons Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua were killed before his eyes. Gravely wounded and surrounded by enemies, Saul, in despair, asked his armor-bearer to kill him to avoid humiliation at the hands of the Philistines. When the squire refused, Saul took his own sword and threw himself upon it, ending his life in the midst of the battlefield, in a final act of despair and loneliness. 3 days later, a young Amalekite man brought the news to David in Ziklag. His torn clothes and dejected expression betrayed the gravity of the events. In quick words, the messenger reported Israel's defeat, the deaths of Saul and Jonathan, and delivered to David the king's crown and bracelet as proof of his story. Thinking he would receive a reward, he confessed that he had ended Saul's life at the king's own request. However, David, faithful to the principles that had always guided his life, considered the act an outrage against the Lord's anointed and ordered the Amalekites' execution right there. The news of Saul's death, and especially Jonathan's, broke David's heart. Deeply grieved, he tore his clothes in mourning, and all his followers wept and fasted in remembrance of those who had fallen in Israel. There was no triumphalism or vengeance in his words. On the contrary, David composed a moving elegy, a lament preserved in Scripture, extolling the bravery of the warriors and the nobility of his dear friend. In each verse, David expressed sorrow for a generation that was dying out and for the glory of Israel that had been violently tarnished that day. David's lament revealed once again the depth of his character. He didn't see Saul merely as the king who persecuted him, he saw in him God's anointed, and in Jonathan, the kindred spirit whom life leads. "Oh, how the mighty have fallen!" David exclaimed in 1 Samuel 1:21, an expression that would echo throughout history, marking the end of an era and the beginning of a new one. The void left by Saul's death opened the door to the fulfillment of a promise made years before, but for David it was not yet time for celebration. It was a time of tears, honor, and respect before the hand of God, who silently and relentlessly carried out his decrees. Even as Israel mourned the loss of its king, the hand of the Almighty continued to move history toward a new chapter. In the heart of the grief, seeds of hope were sprouting. The young man who had been secretly anointed in the field of Bethlehem now stood before the greatest calling of his life. But before wielding the scepter, David needed to fully recognize the weight of the responsibility that would be entrusted to him. For the throne of Israel would not only be a symbol of power, but a sacred mission before the Eternal. After Saul's death, the nation of Israel was plunged into chaos and division. Still reeling from the tragedy at Mount Gilboa, the tribes lacked unified leadership. David, however, did not act rashly. Before any political or military move, he sought the Lord's guidance. In sincere prayer, he asked if he should go up to some city in Judah, and the Lord answered him, "Go up." When he inquired which city, the answer was clear, Hebron, according to 2 Samuel 1. Obediently, David moved to Hebron, taking with him his 2 wives, Inuah of Gezreel and Begihu, the widow of Nabal, as well as all the men who had accompanied him on his journey as a fugitive. In Hebron, David was received by the people of Judah, who recognized him as the true king and formally anointed him over the tribe. It was the visible beginning of the fulfillment of the promise made years before, when Samuel, still in secret, anointed him in Jesse's house. For 7.5 years, David reigned only over Judah, while the other tribes of Israel remained under the fragmented leadership of the house of Saul, led by Ishbosheth, Saul's son, under the tutelage of Abner, the army commander. The complete unification of Israel was still a distant goal, but the hand of God was moving events piece by piece toward its realization. During this period, David consolidated his political and military base. Wisely, he sent a message to the men of Jabez Gilead, praising them for the honor they had shown Saul by giving him a proper burial. More than just words of courtesy, this gesture was a strategic move, seeking to win the favor of the followers of the house of Saul and build bridges for the future unification of the kingdom. Meanwhile, Hebron flourished under his leadership, and respect for David grew not only in Judah but in neighboring regions as well. Tension between the houses of Saul and David, however, was inevitable. Abner, a man of strength and ambition, supported Ishbosheth as king over the other tribes. Armed conflicts began to emerge, with skirmishes and bloody battles, such as the famous battle at the Assyrian War of Gibeon. While blood flowed on the battlefields, David's heart remained anchored in the promise the Lord had made to him. Over the years, the balance of power began to naturally shift in David's favor. Saul's house grew weaker with each conflict, corroded by a lack of legitimate leadership and internal betrayals. Abner, resentful of Ishbosheth's unjust accusations, decided to switch sides, offering David the loyalty of all Israel. This turnaround was crucial. Abner gathered the tribes and began negotiations to transfer authority over the north to the king of Judah. Despite Abner's treacherous death at the hands of Joab, the unification process was already irreversible. David, ever prudent, publicly mourned Abner's death, demonstrating justice and compassion before the people. With each thoughtful action, he won over not only the soldiers and tribal leaders, but also the hearts of the common people. The man who had spared Saul out of reverence for God now walked with the same reverence to unite a shattered nation, not by imposition, but by legitimate conquest. The hand of the Lord continued to guide him, and with each step, David proved himself more worthy of the title of king, according to God's heart. With the assassination of Ishbosheth, the leaders of all the tribes of Israel recognized that there was no longer any reason for resistance. They went to Hebron and, in a historic gesture, anointed David as king over all Israel. At the age of 30, the young shepherd from Bethlehem, shaped by suffering, persecution, and loyalty, finally assumed the throne of a unified nation. The promise made so many years before, bathed in tears, dangers, and escapes, was now becoming a reality. But there was still much more to be written in this story that would transcend generations. After being crowned king of all Israel, David wasted no time in consolidating his authority. His first major act as a unified sovereign was to target a strategic city that still remained outside Israelite control, Jerusalem. The city was inhabited by the Jebusites, an ancient people confident in their fortifications, certain that not even the most daring king could penetrate its walls. They mocked David, saying that even the blind and the lame could defend them. But what seemed impossible in human eyes was only the beginning of the fulfillment of God's plan for Israel. With a bold strategy, David ordered his men to enter through the underground water passage, an unexpected route that bypassed the Jebusite defenses. In a short time, Jerusalem was conquered, not only by force, but by the military intelligence and courage that would define David's reign. He established his capital there, naming it the City of David. It was more than just a military victory. Jerusalem would be the spiritual, political, and historical center of the chosen people, the seat of government that would represent the covenant between God and his people on earth. In establishing his new capital, David also demonstrated his planning skills. He began fortifying the surrounding areas, expanding the city and preparing it to become the seat of an empire that would one day achieve unprecedented glory. With each stone laid, with each wall erected, Jerusalem took shape not only as a city, but as an eternal symbol of God's presence among men. David, more than a warrior, proved himself to be a builder of prophetic dreams. God confirmed at every step that he was with David. Hiram, king of Tyre, recognizing the strength of the new sovereign, sent building materials and artisans to construct a palace worthy of a king. David, humble in spirit, did not attribute the victory to himself. He recognized that this was the work of the Lord, who was establishing him as the shepherd of Israel and not merely as a human ruler. His awareness that he reigned for God and not for himself shaped his rule in a unique way throughout the history of the Old Testament. As David grew in power and prestige, the challenge from the Philistines resurfaced. They, who had underestimated the young shepherd years before, now feared the anointed king. They gathered their armies to try to overthrow the new government. David, true to his practice of seeking divine guidance, did not rely solely on his military experience. He consulted the Lord, who guaranteed him victory. At Baal-perazim, the Lord broke through the enemy lines like a torrent of rushing waters, assuring the people of Israel that their king was guided by the hand of the Most High. Not satisfied with his first victory, David faced a second offensive from the Philistines. Once again, God instructed his strategy, commanding him to attack from behind, waiting for the signal of movement in the tops of the mulberry trees. a spiritual sign that the Lord was marching at the head of his army. Obedient, David attacked at the precise moment and achieved an overwhelming victory, further consolidating his dominion over the region and freeing Israel from the constant threats of its enemies. With Jerusalem under his command and Israel unified under his leadership, David had not only established a strong kingdom, he had initiated a new era for God's people. An era of hope, of promises beginning to be fulfilled, and of a capital that would forever be the spiritual heart of the world. But deep within David, there burned an even greater longing, to bring the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem and make the city the true throne of the Lord in the land of the living. With Jerusalem established as the capital and the kingdom consolidated, David turned his attention to what truly moved his heart. The presence of God among his people. He wished to bring the Ark of the Covenant, the ultimate symbol of the divine covenant, to the new city. The preparations were made with care and celebration, but on the first attempt, due to a failure to follow the correct procedures, tragedy struck the procession. When Uzzah touched the ark improperly, he was struck down by the holiness of the Lord, teaching everyone that even zeal needed to be guided by absolute reverence for divine instructions. David, deeply affected, suspended the transport, and the ark was temporarily left in the house of Obed the Edomite. There, extraordinary blessings fell upon the house, confirming that God's presence brings prosperity to those who honor him. After gaining a better understanding of the sanctity of the act, David organized a new ceremony, this time with sacrifices, praise, and profound reverence. The ark finally arrived in Jerusalem, and David, dressed in priestly linen, danced with all his might before the Lord. Without regard for royal protocol, but concerned only with pleasing God's heart. This attitude generated criticism, including from Michal, Saul's daughter and David's wife, who despised his gesture of humility. However, David firmly replied that he would rather be humiliated in the eyes of men if it meant being honored before the Lord. His sincere worship and his desire to exalt God above all else showed that his reign would not only be political, but profoundly spiritual. David didn't just want to rule over people. He wanted God to reign sovereignly over Israel through his government. It was in this context that God sent the prophet Nathan with an extraordinary message. David, who wished to build a permanent temple for the ark, was initially granted his wish. However, the Lord revealed that David would not be the one to build the temple, but that his son would. Moreover, God established an eternal covenant with David, promising that his descendants would reign forever and that from his lineage would arise the Messiah, the Savior of the world. It was a promise that transcended any earthly throne, taking root in eternity. Upon hearing this revelation, David prostrated himself in worship, acknowledging God's grace and well-deserved blessing upon his life. Instead of being filled with pride, David responded with reverence, further solidifying his reputation as a man after God's own heart. The Davidic covenant became the backbone of messianic hope, and the name of David would be remembered forever among those who await redemption. Under his leadership, Israel experienced a time of unprecedented expansion, military victories, and national strengthening. David defeated the Philistines, the Moabites, the Syrians, and many other surrounding peoples, establishing Israel's hegemony throughout the region. His kingdom was admired, feared, and respected. But the true throne he was building was not merely of gold or stone. It was a spiritual throne, pointing to the day when David's son would reign not only over Israel, but over the whole earth. However, the same man who was exalted by the Lord was about to make decisions that would change his story forever. The decline began when David started to distance himself from what had once made him strong. He no longer led his troops on the battlefield as he once did. While his soldiers fought against Israel's enemies, the king remained in the comfort of the palace. Perhaps age, fatigue, or even the weight of royalty had made him complacent, but it was precisely in this moment of inactivity that his greatest weakness was revealed. The Bible teaches that idleness can be a trap, and David was about to fall into it. One night, while walking on the terrace of his palace, his gaze was drawn to something he shouldn't have seen. Below, in a nearby house, a woman was bathing, unaware that she was being watched by the most powerful man in Israel. The king, who had faced armies and giants, now battled an invisible enemy, desire. The attraction was immediate and intense. His heart raced and his mind was torn between reason and temptation. David should not have stayed there, but he did. He watched for long enough for the desire to turn into an obsession. He wanted to know who that woman was. He ordered his servants to find out his name, and the answer was as quick as it was worrying. "It is Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam, wife of Uriah the Hittite." The king knew Uriah. He knew that he was one of his most loyal soldiers, a man of honor who was fighting for Israel at that moment. Knowing that she was married should have been enough for David to stay away. But instead, he hesitated. He allowed the desire to grow within him, silently justifying his will. Perhaps he became convinced that as king, nothing was forbidden to him. That thought was enough for him to take the next step. He summoned Bathsheba to the palace. When the woman received the invitation, she was confused. Why did the king want to see her? What could be so urgent? But one thing she knew for sure. No one refused a summons from the king. She went without questioning. David greeted her with a look that mixed admiration and guilt. She stood before the most powerful man in Israel, and at that moment her fate was sealed. When Bathsheba entered the palace, the atmosphere was thick with an invisible tension. She was not a woman of high standing, but now she stood before the king of Israel. David tried to steer the conversation in a casual manner, mentioning Uriah's bravery and unquestionable loyalty. However, there was something in his gaze that made it clear that this visit was not just an ordinary conversation. Bathsheba felt the weight of the situation, but there was no room for resistance. After all, when faced with a king, any refusal could have unpredictable consequences. David was a persuasive man. He had earned the respect and admiration of the people, not only for his victories, but also for his intelligence and charisma. Now, he used that same skill to get closer to Bathsheba. The unfriendly conversation began to change tone. He praised her beauty, her grace, her presence. Her silence was not one of acceptance, but of uncertainty. He knew he was in a vulnerable position, but the king's power was absolute. So David crossed a line that could never be undone. The man who had composed psalms of praise and repentance, God's chosen one, allowed his desire to dominate him. The Bible doesn't detail how Bathsheba reacted, but the context suggests she had no choice. He was the king, and no one questioned him. Absolute power creates realities where resistance becomes impossible. When it was all over, the silence between them was overwhelming. Bathsheba dressed quickly, her mind probably filled with unanswered questions. David, on the other hand, stood still, watching as they left. His heart was restless, but at that moment he allowed himself to believe that everything would be in the past. He never imagined that that night would set in motion a chain of events that would bring misfortune to his home and his kingdom. In the days that followed, David tried to continue his routine. The king who ruled Israel, who confronted armies and administered a nation, showed no signs of public remorse. But then, an unexpected message arrived. Just 3 words, but laden with devastating weight. "I am pregnant." The shock was immediate. The king, who thought he had everything under control, realized that his betrayal could not be buried so easily. David's mind was in a whirlwind of thoughts. He knew that the sin could not be revealed. A scandal like this could damage his reputation and jeopardize his reign. More than that, it was a crime against God, against Israel, and against one of its most loyal soldiers. But instead of seeking immediate repentance, his mind began to devise a plan. If we could cover everything up, perhaps the truth would never come out. Atona Pontidavi, the king who had so often trusted in the Lord to win battles, now relied on his own cunning to conceal his error. But would the plan you were about to devise work? Or else God himself would intervene to reveal the truth, but David knew he could not allow his transgression to be discovered. If the people knew that he had slept with the wife of one of his soldiers, his honor as king and servant of God would be compromised. He needed a quick solution, something that would erase the evidence before suspicions arose. And the solution came in the form of a deception. If Uriah spent a night with his wife, everyone would believe the child was his. Without wasting any time, David sent an order to Commander Joab, demanding that Uriah return from the battlefield. He pretended to want a report on the war, but his true intention was something else. When Uriah arrived at the palace, the king received him cordially. He asked about the combat, about the soldiers, about the army's morale. Uriah, ever loyal, responded with respect and sincerity, without imagining that he was facing a man who had betrayed his trust in the worst possible way. David then suggested that Uriah return home that night. He said that he deserved rest, that he should enjoy his wife's company before returning to the war. It was an order disguised as kindness, a carefully crafted plan to cover up sin. But Uriah was a man of honor, and his answer took David by surprise. "How can I go home and lie down with my wife while my brothers in arms sleep in the open on the battlefield?" He refused to go home and spent the night among the palace servants. David wasn't expecting that. Uriah was not only loyal on the battlefield. He was a man of integrity, true to his principles. But the king did not give up. The following night, he tried a different approach. He offered wine and a banquet to the soldier, hoping that, once drunk, he would change his mind and go to Bathsheba. However, even under the influence of alcohol, Uriah maintained his decision and slept in the palace courtyard. The plan's failure left David uneasy. His sin was about to be exposed, and for the first time, he realized he couldn't cover it up with simple tricks. But instead of repenting, instead of confessing and seeking God's mercy, the king made an even darker decision. If Uriah had not been manipulated into covering up the mistake, he would have had to be eliminated. With his mind already clouded by sin, David wrote a letter to Joab, his war commander. The words he inscribed on that parchment would seal the fate of an innocent man. He ordered Uriah to be placed on the front line of battle and, at the most intense moment of combat, for the soldiers to retreat, leaving him alone to die. The cruel irony was that David delivered this very letter into the hands of Uriah, who unknowingly carried his death sentence. The loyal soldier left without question. He could never have imagined that the one he served with such respect and loyalty had become his greatest enemy. But did David really believe he could escape the consequences? Could such a wicked plan go unnoticed in the eyes of God? Uriah returned to the battlefield, unaware that he carried his own death sentence. For him, that mission was just another proof of his loyalty to the king and to Israel. Upon arriving, he delivered the letter to Joab, the war commander. Joab knew Uriah's character well. "I knew he was one of the most honorable warriors in the army." However, as she read the king's words, she felt a chill run down her spine. The order was clear and cruel. Uriah was to be sent to the most dangerous part of the battle, and at the critical moment, all the soldiers were to retreat, leaving him alone to face the enemy. Joab could have questioned the order, but he did not. He knew that disobeying the king meant signing his own death warrant. So, without revealing anything to Uriah, he put him in charge of the front line. The warrior did not hesitate. With courage, he led his men into battle, believing he was serving his nation and his king in the best way possible. He didn't know that behind the scenes his fate was already sealed. The battle began, and Uriah advanced with determination. He didn't immediately realize something was wrong, but when he looked around he noticed his companions were retreating. Shock washed over her face. What was happening? Why were they leaving him behind? He shouted, calling for his soldiers, but no one answered. Her heart raced, and the reality of the betrayal began to sink in. The enemies perceived their vulnerability and showed no mercy. The swords tore through the air, the arrows cut through his skin. Uriah fought bravely, trying to defend himself, trying to survive, but he was alone. The man who had never hesitated to risk his life for the king was now abandoned, without any chance of escape. His body fell to the ground, covered in blood, and his last vision was of the empty battlefield behind him. The same land where he should be surrounded by his brothers in arms. It was now a place of betrayal and death. When news of Uriah's death reached the camp, Joab did his duty and sent a messenger back to Jerusalem. The king needed to be informed, but Joab, knowing David, gave the messenger a clear instruction. If the king became angry with the way the battle had been conducted, he should simply say, "Uriah the Hittite is dead." That phrase would have been enough to calm David, as it meant his plan had worked. When the messenger arrived at the palace, he delivered the message. David listened attentively, but his only reaction was a long silence. He took a deep breath and replied, "That's what war is like. Some fall, others live." His face was expressionless, but inside, a weight was beginning to grow. The problem seemed solved, the scandal seemed buried. However, what David didn't know was that God was already preparing his answer. Sin may be hidden from men, but it never goes unnoticed in the eyes of the Lord. The king then took Bathsheba as his wife. To the people, this might seem like an act of mercy and kindness. A king who cared for the widow of a fallen hero. But in David's heart, he knew the truth. And above all, God knew too. Did the king really believe he could escape the consequences of his actions? Or was divine judgment about to overtake him in a way he could never have imagined? Days passed and David tried to go on with his life as if nothing had happened. To the people, he was a noble king who had taken in the widow of a loyal warrior. But in the silence of the nights, when no one was watching, the weight of his choice seemed to haunt him. He knew he had committed a grave sin, but he still believed he could hide it. However, God would not allow this wrong to go unpunished. The Lord sent the king a prophet, someone who would bring to light the truth that David was trying to bury. The prophet Nathan arrived at the palace with a message that was not his own, but God's. David always respected Nathan, for he knew that his words were filled with wisdom and justice. When the prophet began to speak, the king listened attentively. But instead of confronting him directly, Nathan told him a story. He said, "There were two men in a city. One was very rich and had many sheep and cattle. The other was poor and owned only one small sheep, whom he loved like a daughter. She ate from his table, drank from his cup, and slept in his arms. One day, the rich man received a visitor. But instead of taking one of his own sheep to prepare a meal, he took the poor man's only sheep and slaughtered it to serve to his guest." Indignation took hold of David. He stood up furious and declared firmly, "This man deserves death, he must pay 4 times over for what he did." His sense of justice was strong, but he still hadn't realized the trap Nathan had set for him. The prophet then looked directly into the king's eyes and said, "You are that man." The room fell silent. David's heart raced and his face turned pale. He understood immediately. What Nathan had recounted was not merely a parable, it was an exact reflection of his own story. God had seen everything, from the first glance at Bathsheba to the sending of the letter that sealed Uriah's fate. David, the man after God's own heart, had committed a terrible sin and was now being confronted by the Lord himself. Nathan then announced the divine judgment. "Thus says the Lord, I will anoint you over Israel and deliver you from the hand of Saul. I gave you everything, and if that wasn't enough, I would have given you even more. But why have you despised the word of the Lord, doing what is evil in his eyes? You killed Uriah with the sword of the Ammonites and took his wife to be yours. Therefore, the sword will never depart from your house, and evil will arise from your own family. And the child born from this union will die." David felt his strength failing. He didn't try to justify himself, he didn't blame anyone, he didn't look for an excuse. He knew that Nathan was telling the truth and that God had witnessed every one of his actions. With tears in his eyes, he fell to his knees and confessed, "I have sinned against the Lord." His repentance was genuine, but divine judgment had already been decreed. He could be forgiven, but the consequences of his actions would not be erased. Your home would never be the same. His reign would never be the same. And the death of her son would only be the beginning of the storm that was to come. God's judgment was immediate. The first blow came upon David's house in a devastating way. Just as Nathan prophesied, the son born from the illicit union between David and Bathsheba would be gravely ill. The king, who had so often witnessed miracles and divine interventions. Now he found himself powerless before the divine sentence. Despair gripped his heart, and he did what he could. He threw himself into prayer and fasting, crying out for mercy. For days, David refused food and comfort. He fell to the ground, weeping, begging God to spare the boy's life. His servants watched from a distance, afraid to approach. They had never seen the king like that before. The man who had once been a great warrior to me, who had marched against giants and enemy kingdoms, was now reduced to a broken man, facing the only battle he could not win. The consequence of their own sin. But the Lord's judgment was not revoked. On the seventh day, the son of David and Bathsheba died. The servants hesitated to tell the king, fearing his reaction. If he was so desperate while the child was still alive, what would he do now that she was? He was gone, but David noticed the murmuring and worried looks on his servants' faces. He understood before anyone even had to say it. The boy was dead. To everyone's surprise, David got up, washed himself, changed his clothes, and went to the temple of the Lord. Ali worshipped God. Then he went back home and ordered food. The servants were astonished. How could the king recover so quickly? How could I simply accept the loss? They couldn't resist and asked. While the child was alive, you fasted and wept. But now that he is dead, you get up and eat. David's response was one of the most profound declarations of the faith that still remained in his heart. While the child was still alive, I fasted and wept, for I thought, who knows? Perhaps the Lord will have mercy on me and let the child live. But now that she is dead, why would I fast? Could I bring her back? I will go to her, but she will not return to me. David accepted divine discipline. He knew that the loss of his son was a reflection of the gravity of his actions. However, amidst the pain, a new truth was forming within him. God is just, but he is also merciful. Despite everything, his story was not yet over. David then turned to Bathsheba. He comforted her, and from this union a new son was born. This boy would not only live, but would carry an extraordinary future. His name was Solomon, and he would become one of the wisest and most powerful kings in the history of Israel. Even in the midst of the trial, God was already beginning to restore what had been broken. But the consequences of David's sin were far from over. David's sin not only brought death to his son, but also cast a shadow over his own house. The prophet Nathan had made it clear. The sword will never depart from your house. Divine judgment would be fulfilled over the years, bringing pain, betrayal, and disgrace within the king's own lineage. The first blow came through Amnon. Amnon, David's firstborn son, was the natural heir to the throne and enjoyed great prestige. However, instead of behaving honorably, he allowed himself to be consumed by an incestuous and morbid desire for his half-sister, Tamar, a young virgin of great beauty and kindness. Driven by this sinful passion, Amnon devised a plan to get closer to Tamar. He feigned being gravely ill, and when his father David came to visit him, he asked that Tamar be sent to prepare food for him on his fourth day, claiming that her presence would comfort him. Without suspecting anything, David complied with the request, and Tamar, innocent and obedient, went to Amnon's house. There, she prepared the meal for him, but when she tried to serve it, Amnon told her to go into his room, where he was lying down. The moment they were alone, he revealed his dark intentions. Tamar, realizing what was about to happen, begged Amnon not to commit such a dishonorable act, reminding him that such an act would be a great shame, not only for her, but for him as well. She suggested that if he wanted her as his wife, he should speak to the king, and that David might allow the union. However, Amnon, overcome by desire, ignored all of Tamar's pleas. The Bible describes it clearly and powerfully, but he refused to listen to what she told him. Being stronger than her, he forced her and lay with her, according to the book of Samuel, 13:14. This brutal act of rape not only destroyed Tamar's honor, but also triggered a series of events that would bring even more tragedy to David's house. After committing the act, Amnon's desire turned into revulsion. The Bible describes how he hated her with an even greater intensity than he had hated Amara before. He ordered Tamar to be expelled from his presence, throwing her out of his house. Tamar, in deep despair and shame, tore her tunic, a symbol of her purity, and placed ashes on her head as a sign of mourning for the misfortune that had befallen her. She was taken in by her brother Absalom, who immediately understood what had happened and offered her shelter. However, Absalom, though furious, asked Tamar to keep quiet about what had happened. When David heard what Amnon had done, he was deeply angry. However, despite his fury, he took no action against his firstborn son. Perhaps because of his position as the future heir to the throne or because of his paternal love, David chose silence, allowing injustice to prevail without consequences. This silence, however, did not heal the open wound in the family. Amnon's impunity planted the seeds of deep resentment in Absalom, who, though appearing calm on the surface, began plotting revenge that would later bring even more bloodshed to the house of David. This tragic event reveals not only the fragility of family relationships in David's household, but also the consequences of silence in the face of injustice. The rape of Tamar was the first major disaster to result from the moral disorder that began with David's own sin. And the repercussions of that act would continue to reverberate through the generations, shaping the tragic history of their lineage. Absalom's revenge begins to take shape soon after the terrible tragedy that befalls his sister Tamar. Desolate and humiliated after the abuse committed by her half-brother Amnon, Tamar finds refuge in the house of Absalom, her blood brother. Upon seeing his sister's suffering, Absalom immediately felt a deep hatred for Amnon. Although seemingly calm, Absalom begins to harbor a thirst for revenge that would only materialize 2 years later. During this time, Absalom never openly displayed his hatred and even avoided direct confrontations with Amnon, creating the false impression that the situation had been forgotten. But inside, he patiently awaited the exact moment to avenge Tamar's dishonor. Absalom's wait ended when he organized a grand banquet for the king's sons, an apparently festive and unsuspecting occasion. He invited all the brothers, including Minon, and made them all believe it was just a celebration. However, behind this festive facade, there was a well-orchestrated plan. Absalom instructed his servants to kill Ammon at the opportune moment, waiting until he was drunk to give the signal. At the height of the celebration, when Amminadab was carefree and vulnerable, Absalom gave the fatal order. So Absalom's servants did to Amnon as Absalom had commanded them. Then all the king's sons got up, each mounted his mule, and fled. According to the book of Samuel, 13:29. Amnon's death was swift and brutal, bringing to the surface all of Absalom's pent-up fury. The murder of Amnon not only deeply shook David's household, but also caused great panic among the king's other sons present at the banquet. Fearing for their lives, they fled quickly, spreading chaos throughout the kingdom. When the news reached David, the king initially believed that all his sons had been killed by Absalom, which plunged him into deep anguish. However, it soon became clear that only Amnon had been murdered. What David feared even more was that this was only the beginning of a series of events that would bring division and destruction to his family. After the revenge was carried out, Absalom could not remain in Jerusalem. Knowing that his actions put him in direct conflict with his father and the kingdom, he fled and went into exile. Absalom sought refuge in the house of his maternal grandfather, Talmai, king of Jesus, where he remained for 3 years. During this time of exile, resentment and pain continued to grow within David's household. David, though deeply saddened by Amnon's death, also missed Absalom, but his exile further increased the emotional distance between father and son. This distancing would gradually plant the seeds for a rebellion that would come later, culminating in an even more devastating confrontation. Absalom's exile was not merely a physical escape, but symbolized a complete rupture within David's family. The act of revenge, although expected given David's passivity regarding Amminadab's crime, triggered a chain of events that would bring even more tragedies. Absalom's rebellion is one of the most turbulent phases in David's life and in the history of the Kingdom of Israel. After 3 years of exile in Geshur, Absalom was still far from his father, David. Despite his longing, David seemed unable to take decisive action to bring his son back. It was then that Joab, David's general, intervened. Seeing the king's distress and the growing tension, Joab devised a way to convince David to allow Absalom's return to Jerusalem. He used a wise woman to tell the king a story that ultimately led David to realize that he should allow his son to return. Absalom was brought back to Jerusalem, but full reconciliation with his father did not happen immediately. Although David allowed Absalom to return, he ordered him to stay away from the royal court. Thus, for 2 years, Absalom lived in Jerusalem without seeing the king's face, a situation that only fueled his bitterness and resentment. During this period of estrangement, Absalom began to win the favor of the people of Israel. He was described as a man of striking beauty, and his charisma attracted many. Absalom positioned himself at the city gates, where he judged the people's cases and won their hearts with his charm and promises of justice. Gradually, he began to undermine David's authority, preparing the ground for what would become a revolt. When Absalom felt he had gathered enough support, he put his plan for rebellion into action. He asked David for permission to go to Hebron, under the pretext of fulfilling a vow he had made to God. However, in Hebron, Absalom declared himself king and began to gather loyal followers. He sent messengers throughout all the tribes of Israel, proclaiming his ascension to the throne. With popular support growing rapidly, Absalom orchestrated a conspiracy that spread throughout the kingdom. The conspiracy was so strong that David, realizing the gravity of the situation, decided to flee Jerusalem to avoid a battle within the city. David's decision was painful and desperate. He knew that Absalom's rebellion was powerful and that it would not be able to withstand a direct attack. David summoned his servants and gave the order to leave the city. Then David said to all his servants who were with him in Jerusalem, "Rise up and let us flee, for we cannot escape from Absalom." According to the book of Samuel, 15:14, with heavy hearts, David and his followers crossed the Kidron Valley and fled into the desert. While David was fleeing, many of the inhabitants of Jerusalem joined him, demonstrating the complexity of divided loyalties within the kingdom. Absalom, now in control of Jerusalem, consolidated his position of power. However, the ultimate battle between him and David was about to take place. David's troops reorganized and prepared to face Absalom's army. The final battle took place in the forest of Ephraim, and although Absalom had a large number of soldiers, David's more experienced army gained the upper hand. During the battle, Absalom, while fleeing on his mule, had his long hair caught in the branches of a tree. He was left hanging between heaven and earth, unable to free himself. Joab, the commander of David's army, learned of the situation and, ignoring the king's order to spare Absalom's life, pierced him with 3 darts, killing him. According to the book of Samuel, 18:9-15, Absalom's death marked the end of the rebellion, but it also brought deep sorrow to David. Even though he was a powerful king and a respected leader, David never stopped being a father. And the loss of his rebellious son, Absalom, revealed the depth of his emotions. When the news of Absalom's death reached him, David was consumed by overwhelming grief, unable to contain his lament. He saw not only the defeat of a traitor or the end of a threat to his throne, but the collapse of a family bond that, despite all the betrayals and misunderstandings, still held a special place in his heart. The story goes that David, upon hearing that Absalom had died in battle, fleeing from his mount and getting his hair caught in a tree, he was not concerned about the victory his armies had just achieved. For him, there was no glory in that battle. All that remained was the devastating loss of a son. In the midst of grief, his words resonated with an intensity that transcends time. "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would that I had died for you, Absalom, my son, my son." Second Book of Samuel, 18:13. These words reveal the heart of a father who, despite all that Absalom had done, from betraying his government to attempting to seize the throne by force, wished he could have traded places with him. David would have preferred to die rather than see his son lose his life in such a tragic and dishonorable way. David's lament is a profoundly human representation of the complexity of paternal love. Even when Absalom turned against him, plotting to seize the kingdom and forcing him to flee Jerusalem, David never stopped loving his son. The conflict between David's position as king and his role as a father is evident. He knew that Absalom needed to be punished for his rebellion, but a father's heart cries out for mercy and reconciliation. With the death of Absalom, the kingdom of Israel experienced a period of relative peace, but also uncertainty regarding the succession to the throne. Adonijah, David's 4th son, saw an opportunity in this uncertainty. He was the oldest of David's living sons and, in his eyes, the natural heir to the throne. However, the king had already promised the throne to another of his sons, Solomon, the son he would have with Sheba. Adonijah, ignoring David's promise and God's will, decided to act on his own. Knowing that an alliance with powerful figures would be essential to securing his ascension to the throne, Adonijah began to surround himself with influential men of great authority. Among those who joined his cause were Joab, the commander of David's forces, and Abiathar, the priest. Joab, who had loyally served David in numerous battles and crucial moments, was a complex character whose motivations were not always transparent. His choice to support Adonijah may have been driven by a mixture of personal ambition and dissatisfaction with the direction the court was taking. Abiathar, with a long history of service to the king, also joined Adonijah, possibly hoping for a prominent position in the new kingdom that was taking shape. With the backing of such influential figures, Adonias felt encouraged to move forward with his claim to the throne. He organized a grand ceremony to proclaim himself king, carefully choosing the location and guests to avoid opposition. The event took place at En-Rogel, a water source near Jerusalem, a strategic location accessible enough to attract support, but far enough away to escape immediate intervention by David or his allies. Adonijah invited all his brothers except Solomon, and selected the military leaders of Judah who supported his cause, excluding those loyal to David and Solomon. Notably, he excluded important allies of David, such as the prophet Nathan, Benaiah, and the elite guards who protected the king. During the ceremony, Adonijah offered sacrifices of sheep, oxen, and fattened calves. A demonstration of both wealth and spiritual power. Such sacrifices held great religious and political significance, serving as a way to present one's candidacy for the throne as divinely supported. For the Lord delights in those who fear him, who put their hope in his unfailing love. Psalms. By performing the sacrifices, Adonijah implied that God was on his side. The presence of Joab and Abiathar, key figures in the armies and in religion, reinforced the legitimacy of his claim to the throne, conveying the idea that the new regime had both military and spiritual support. However, Adonijah's conspiracy and his attempt to consolidate his power as king did not go unnoticed. Nathan, the prophet, David's faithful advisor and spokesman for God's will, understood the gravity of the situation. He knew that if Adonijah succeeded, God's promise to David regarding Solomon's succession would be jeopardized. After all, God had told David, your son, that he would come from you, succeed me, and build my temple. Chronicles 28:6. Nathan predicted that Adonijah's rise to power could lead to civil war or, at the very least, cause prolonged instability in Israel. With this in mind, Nathan sought out Bathsheba, Solomon's mother, and together they devised a plan to inform David about the conspiracy and ensure that God's promise would be fulfilled. Nathan, realizing the seriousness of the situation, advised Bathsheba to directly question David as to whether he had changed his mind or whether Adonijah was acting without the king's consent. The goal was not only to inform David about the impending betrayal, but also to appeal to his sense of duty, reaffirming the covenant with God that would guarantee Solomon's succession. Next, Nathan would also enter to reinforce Bathsheba's message, emphasizing the urgency of the moment. In Proverbs 21, we read, "The king's heart is like a river controlled by the Lord. He directs it wherever he wants." Nathan knew that God was in control, but also that it was necessary to act with wisdom and promptness. Nathan and Bathsheba's strategy worked as planned. Bathsheba presented herself to David and expressed her concern for the fate of Solomon and the kingdom, emphasizing that if Adonijah became king, both she and her son would be in great danger. After his speech, Nathan entered and confirmed the reports, informing David about the ceremony that Adonijah would hold in En-Rogel to proclaim himself king. He warned David that if he did not act immediately, the throne would be usurped by Adonijah, and God's promise that Solomon would be David's successor would never be fulfilled. In reminding David of the words of 1 Samuel 7:12-13, where God had promised, "When your days are fulfilled and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, one of your own sons, and I will establish your kingdom." Nathan reiterated the importance of acting without delay. David's response was quick and decisive. He ordered Solomon to be anointed and proclaimed king urgently, with Benaiah playing a key role in the process. Along with the priest Zadok and the prophet Nathan, Benaiah led Solomon to Gibeon, where he was anointed king, solidifying his claim to the throne and thwarting Adonijah's plans. David's swift action, influenced by the wise intervention of Nathan and Bathsheba, ensured that Adonijah's conspiracy was temporarily thwarted and that the divine promise was fulfilled. In 1 Kings 1:39, we read, "Zadok the priest took the horn of oil from the tabernacle and anointed Solomon. And they sounded the trumpet, and all the people shouted, 'Long live King Solomon!'" Immediately after the anointing, a great celebration took over the people of Jerusalem. To the sound of trumpets, the people shouted, "Long live King Solomon!" And the city was enveloped in an atmosphere of jubilation and celebration. This public show of support for the new king was crucial, as it demonstrated that the nation's heart was with Solomon, rendering any attempt by Adonijah to claim the throne completely fruitless. Popular support consolidated Solomon's power and undermined the basis for any remaining conspiracy. Meanwhile, Adonijah and his allies were still celebrating their supposed victory, completely oblivious to the change that had occurred. However, when the sound of the trumpets and the shouts of acclamation from the people of Jerusalem reached them, Adonijah's celebration abruptly ceased. In 1 Kings 141:49, the reaction of Adonijah and his followers is described in detail. Joab, a seasoned veteran of intrigue and battle, was the first to realize something was wrong, questioning the growing noise. Therefore, they understood that devastating news was on its way. Solomon had been proclaimed king, and Adonijah's conspiracy was doomed. Upon learning of this, fear and panic quickly spread among Adonijah and his followers. Everyone realized that their conspiracy had been exposed, and now their lives were in danger. The guests who had previously supported Adonias began to disperse, each trying to save their own skin. The celebratory atmosphere that reigned at the banquet gave way to despair and chaos. Adonijah, who moments before saw himself as the rightful king of Israel, now faced the harsh reality of his imminent downfall. Overcome with fear for his life, Adonijah ran toward the altar of the Lord, clinging tightly to the horns of the altar, a symbolic gesture of seeking mercy and divine protection. This action reflected not only his desperation, but also his acknowledgement of his guilt and the failure of his endeavor. The altar was seen as a sacred place, where those seeking refuge could plead for mercy. In 1 Kings, chapter 50, we read that Adonijah, fearing Solomon, rose up and took hold of the horns of the altar. By doing this, Adonijah hoped that the sacredness of the altar would save him from Solomon's wrath and that the new king would grant him forgiveness. As Adonijah remained at the altar, he knew that his only hope was the mercy of Solomon. The appeal to the sanctuary was an attempt to touch the heart of the new king and convince him to spare his life. In 1 Kings 41, Adonijah sent a message to Solomon, pleading for his life. This act of submission revealed that Adonijah was fully aware of his weakness in the face of Solomon's power and depended entirely on his mercy. Adoniah's request, based on the tradition of seeking refuge at the altar, reflected his hope that compassion, not vengeance, would prevail in the heart of the new monarch. Solomon, newly anointed king of Israel, now faced a crucial decision. He could undoubtedly choose to eliminate Adonijah, thus ensuring that no future threat to his throne would arise. However, in a display of wisdom and prudence, Solomon chose the path of clemency. He agreed to spare Adonijah's life, but under strict conditions. In 1 Kings 1:52, Solomon declared, "If a man proves himself a good man, not a hair of his head will fall to the ground, but if wickedness is found in him, he will die." Solomon was clear in his stance: as long as Adonijah remained loyal and did not attempt to conspire again, his life would be spared. Otherwise, he would face the consequences. With this, Solomon not only demonstrated compassion, but also made it clear that his reign would be firm and vigilant against any threat. Adonijah, recognizing that he had no other choice, he accepted Solomon's offer of clemency and was brought into the presence of the new king. Before Solomon, he prostrated himself in a sign of complete submission, acknowledging his inferiority. Solomon, in a gesture of magnanimity, allowed Adonijah to return to his home, but tension remained in the air. Although forgiveness was granted, Solomon's decision was a test of loyalty for Adonijah. The new king's clemency represented both a show of force and an expectation that his half-brother would accept his new position without further protest. However, as biblical history reveals, this would not be the last time Adonijah's name would surface in the intrigues of the kingdom. Some time later, Adonias made one last attempt to regain power, presenting a request that at first glance might seem simple, but which carried profound political implications. He approached Bathsheba, Solomon's mother, and asked her to intercede with the king on his behalf, so that he might be granted the hand of Absag the Tsunamite in marriage. Absag had served as David's caretaker in his final days, and although the biblical text does not suggest that David had any intimate relationship with her. In the culture of that time, the king's concubine held a status that could not be ignored. By asking to marry Absag, Adonijah knew that this would be seen as an attempt to get closer to the throne, since traditionally the possession of royal concubines could be interpreted as a right to power. He subtly sought to claim a position of influence and authority, indirectly challenging Solomon. Bathsheba, perhaps without fully understanding the consequences of Adonijah's request, took her request to Solomon. However, Solomon, known for his wisdom, a gift bestowed upon him directly by God, as described in 1 Kings 3:12. I will give you a wise and discerning heart, so that no one has ever had before, nor will anyone ever have again. He immediately perceived Adonias' hidden intentions. He understood that this request was a veiled attempt to legitimize a new claim to the throne. In 1 Kings 22:22-24, Solomon responds sternly, saying, "Why are you asking Absag, the Tsunami, for Adonijah? Ask for the kingdom for him as well." Solomon knew that by allowing such a union, he would open the door to a new cycle of conspiracies. Realizing the gravity of the situation, he decided that Adonijah continued to be a threat to his sovereignty and the stability of the kingdom. Aware of the threat that Adonijah still represented, Solomon made the decision to definitively eliminate his half-brother. He understood that allowing Adonijah to continue living with his hidden ambitions would jeopardize both his reign and the peace of the kingdom. With a show of firmness and authority, Solomon ordered the execution of Adonijah, thus eliminating the possibility of a new conspiracy. Solomon's decision was not taken lightly, but was a necessary measure to ensure the continuity of his rule, as God himself had promised David. Benaiah, the commander of the royal guard and a man of utmost confidence to Solomon, was appointed to carry out this order. With loyalty and without hesitation, Benaiah executed Adonijah, ensuring that Solomon's throne would be protected from any future threat. This act, though harsh, was vital to preserving order in the kingdom and demonstrating that Solomon would not tolerate treachery. Furthermore, Benaiah was also tasked with dealing with other figures who threatened the stability of the kingdom, such as Joab, who had supported Adonijah in his attempted usurpation. Joab, aware of his betrayal, sought refuge at the altar of the tabernacle, believing that the holiness of the place would guarantee him protection. However, Solomon, determined to put an end to all threats, ordered Benaiah to execute him. Thus ended the life of a man who had been loyal to David, but who, in the end, became a potential danger to the continuation of the lineage chosen by God to rule Israel. With the beginning of his reign, Solomon received from David not only the crown, but also profound advice on how to govern with righteousness and fear of the Lord. The old king, on his deathbed, spoke to Solomon as a father and as a servant of God, recalling the principles that had underpinned his own reign. David knew that the future of Israel would depend on the new king's faithfulness to the covenant with the Lord. Solomon's early decisions demonstrated that he understood the gravity of the responsibility he had inherited. The new king did not hesitate to act against those who threatened the stability of the throne. Adonijah, Joab, and the priest Abiathar were held accountable for their actions. These firm measures were not only political, but also spiritual. Solomon was clearing the way for a government that would begin aligned with God's will. Solomon's rise to power was therefore marked by intrigue, difficult decisions, and clear divine intervention. The new king ascended the throne with the Lord's blessing, the guidance of the prophets, and the support of the people. But what would follow would reveal that, even with a solid foundation, a reign can be shaped or destroyed by the choices you make along the way. If you enjoy content like this, please like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below. Where are you watching this video from? Your participation strengthens our community and helps this message reach more lives. Right from the start of his reign, Solomon demonstrated that he wished to follow a different path from kings who sought personal glory. He went to Gibeon, one of the most important centers of worship at the time, to offer sacrifices to the Lord. That was where the ancient bronze altar, built by Moses in the desert, used to be. Solomon's gesture indicated reverence and also a desire to begin his reign in communion with God. He offered 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar, a number that impressed not only for its quantity but for the sincerity it represented. That same night, God appeared to Solomon in a dream. It wasn't just any meeting. The Lord, who cannot be manipulated by empty rituals, recognized in that young king a genuine willingness to seek his presence. And then he asked him a question that would change the course of Israel's history. "Ask me for whatever you want and I will give it to you." This moment described in 1 Kings, chapter 3, is not only magnificent. It is deeply revealing about the relationship between the king and his God. Solomon could have asked for riches, victory over his enemies, or a long life. But he asked for wisdom. Acknowledging his youth and inexperience, Solomon asked for an understanding heart, capable of judging the people justly. He saw himself as a servant facing a gigantic task, governing God's chosen people. His prayer displayed not vanity, but fear, humility, and discernment. It was a rare request, coming from someone who had just ascended the throne. God's response was immediate and generous. The Lord was pleased with Solomon's choice and not only granted him unparalleled wisdom, but also what he had not asked for: riches, honor, and longevity, on the condition that he remained faithful to the commandments. From that moment on, Solomon's name would begin to be associated with wisdom in every corner of the known world. The young king had laid the foundations for a just, blessed, and promising reign. It didn't take long for this wisdom to manifest itself in a practical and impressive way. The case of the 2 women disputing the maternity of a baby became emblematic. Faced with the impasse, Solomon proposed that the child be divided in half. Not because he actually intended to commit this atrocity, but to reveal the truth. The woman who loved her son preferred to give him up rather than see him dead. That was the definitive proof. The people heard about this judgment and came to fear and respect the wisdom of the new king. This episode solidified Solomon's image as a ruler endowed with supernatural discernment. It was evident to all that the Spirit of God was upon him. The elders of Israel, the foreign leaders, and the common people recognized something different in their king. He ruled not only with human logic, but with divine inspiration. This attracted admiration and also raised the moral and spiritual standards of the nation. But that was only the beginning. The wisdom that Solomon had received was not static. It would manifest itself in a grand way in political decisions, diplomatic alliances, and ambitious projects to come. The throne was secure, the people were hopeful, and God's promise still resonated in the heart of the man who was now the wisest on earth. With the kingdom stabilized and divine wisdom guiding his decisions, Solomon turned his attention to one of the most sacred tasks inherited from his father, the construction of the Lord's temple. David had desired to build a house for God, but was prevented by the Lord himself because he had been a man of war and bloodshed. Therefore, Calby, a man of peace, was tasked with turning this dream into reality. The project was more than just a building. It was the embodiment of the divine presence among the people of Israel. Solomon spared neither effort nor resources. The temple would be the center of faith for an entire nation and needed to reflect the glory of God. Cedars of Lebanon, supplied by King Hiram of Tyre, they were transported with precision. Carved stones, pure gold, and cast bronze comprised every detail of the work. The most skilled craftsmen were summoned, and Solomon himself oversaw the progress. For 7 years, the work was carried out with reverence, without the sound of hammers or metal tools at the construction site. Everything was done with order and holiness. The temple structure was impressive. The Holy of Holies, the most sacred place, was designed to house the Ark of the Covenant. Its inner walls were covered in gold, and 2 giant cherubim were placed there, with wings that touched in the center. It was there that the high priest would enter once a year to make atonement for the people. The glory of God that had dwelt in the tent in the desert would now have a permanent place among the children of Israel. When the temple was completed, Solomon gathered all the leadership of Israel, the elders and priests, for the dedication ceremony. The Ark of the Covenant was brought in a solemn procession, and when the priests placed it in its place, a cloud filled the temple, symbolizing the presence of the Lord. Everyone stood in reverent silence. It was the heavenly confirmation that the temple had been accepted, and that God dwelt there. Solomon then offered a long prayer, asking that the temple be a place of answers, reconciliation, and mercy. After the prayer, Solomon stood before the people and blessed them. He declared that the Lord fulfilled all the promises made to David, his father. The people's joy was immense, and for 7 days there were feasts, sacrifices, and celebrations. This dedication marked a new phase in the spiritual history of Israel. The temple was not merely an imposing structure, it was a testament to God's faithfulness and covenant with his people. For the first time, Israel had a fixed place to worship the Lord collectively and reverently. Solomon's temple became a symbol of national unity and the glory of the kingdom. Solomon's fame grew even more after this work. Kings from distant lands heard about the temple and longed to see its magnificence with their own eyes. Jerusalem had become the spiritual and diplomatic center of the entire region. However, behind all that glory lay a subtle challenge: to keep one's heart focused exclusively on the God who dwelt in that temple. This monumental project, while consecrating Solomon in the eyes of the people, also planted the seeds of future tensions. The high cost, the intensive use of labor, and the administrative demands that would follow would have lasting impacts. The temple stood, resplendent. But what would happen when the king, overwhelmed by so many conquests, began to look to other altars? With the temple in Jerusalem completed and peace reigning over the borders of Israel, Solomon reached the height of his glory. His government was marked by political stability, economic growth, and a constant flow of wealth from taxes and alliances. The royal palace, fortifications, and public works demonstrated the king's administrative efficiency. Solomon's name became respected by kings and merchants everywhere, and his fame was not limited to his buildings or treasures, but to the wisdom that everyone wanted to witness with their own ears. It was in this context of splendor that the Queen of Sheba decided to visit Jerusalem. As the ruler of a wealthy region in southern Arabia, she was not there merely out of curiosity. Solomon's fame had spread across deserts, seas, and mountains. She wished to test her wisdom with difficult questions, riddles, and dilemmas that challenged even the wise men of her own court. His arrival was triumphant. A caravan laden with spices, gold, and precious stones accompanied the queen, demonstrating the respect she held for the king of Israel. The meeting between the two monarchs is described in detail in the scriptures. Solomon answered all the queen's questions with precision and depth, leaving her amazed. She not only recognized his wisdom, but was also impressed by the organization of the palace, the behavior of the servants, the attire of the officials, and the sacrifices offered in the temple. Nothing was out of order. For her, reality surpassed everything she had heard in her homeland. The excellence of Solomon's reign was evident in every gesture and structure. In a gesture of diplomatic generosity, the Queen of Sheba offered Solomon a large quantity of gold, spices, and precious stones. A gift that surpassed all previous tributes received by Israel. Solomon, in turn, reciprocated with valuable gifts and everything the queen desired. This exchange sealed a friendly relationship between the two kingdoms, expanding Solomon's international influence. The visit also solidified his image as the wisest and most prosperous man of his time. The presence of the Queen of Sheba in Jerusalem symbolized something greater. She represented the Gentile nations who sought the light of divine wisdom through Israel. Although she was not an Israelite, she recognized God's hand upon Solomon and upon the temple he had built. His words reveal this recognition. This praise, coming from a foreigner, echoed Israel's original mission, to be a light unto the nations. With this visit, Solomon consolidated a highly prestigious diplomatic network. He maintained trade relations with Tyre, Egypt, Arabia, and other neighboring nations. Their ships, in partnership with the Iranian ship Tyre, traveled to Ophir and brought back abundant riches. Gold was becoming so common in Jerusalem that silver was no longer considered valuable. The kingdom's revenues, tribute from subjugated nations, and naval trade placed Solomon at the pinnacle of earthly power. However, amidst such abundance, a subtle change was beginning to emerge in the king's heart. Fame, treasures, and praise could be a blessing, but also a trap. International prestige, though a result of divine wisdom, was beginning to attract alliances to Solomon that, silently, carried with them spiritual dangers. As Solomon's prestige grew, so did his network of political alliances. In ancient times, one of the most effective ways to ensure peace and influence between nations was through royal marriages. Solomon adopted this practice extensively, marrying women from different peoples and cultures. Among them was the daughter of the Pharaoh of Egypt, an alliance that impressed with its diplomatic magnitude, but also raised spiritual questions among the faithful of Israel. The number of Solomon's wives and concubines increased significantly over the years. The Bible reports that he had 700 wives of royal blood and 300 concubines. Many of these women belonged to nations that worshipped foreign gods: Moabites, Ammonites, Sidonians, and Ethians. Although their marriages served a political purpose, the spiritual impact of these relationships was profound and corrosive. The king, who had once erected a magnificent temple for the Lord, was now beginning to build altars for other gods. These women, brought from distant lands, did not come alone. They brought with them their customs, their rituals, and their deities. The influence was subtle at first, but constant. Solomon came to tolerate practices that would previously have been unthinkable in Israel. He began allowing his wives to perform sacrifices on hills, in high places, to gods such as Astarte, Milcom, Camus, and Moloch. And over time, the king himself began to participate in these rituals. The heart of the one chosen by God was no longer exclusively the Lord's. The word of God had been clear since the days of Moses. The Israelites were not to marry people who worshipped other gods. In Deuteronomy 7:3-4, the Lord warned that such unions would corrupt the hearts of Israel. But Solomon ignored this warning. Perhaps he believed that his wisdom would protect him. Perhaps he became convinced that he controlled everything. But the human heart is deceitful, and even the wisest can be seduced when they turn away from God's presence. With a divided heart, Solomon no longer judged with the same clarity. The nation began to perceive the signs of its king's spiritual decline. He who once sought God's guidance in all decisions now seemed to succumb to political pragmatism and personal pleasure. The wisdom that was once the foundation of his reign. It began to sound like a distant echo in the face of the growing idolatry that was spreading through the halls of Jerusalem. It wasn't just about altars that were physically built, but about an altar that had been torn down in the king's heart. Solomon's love for foreign women surpassed the love he had for the Lord. This fact is clearly revealed in the first book of Kings, chapter 11. It was the beginning of a silent decline, almost imperceptible to the eyes of the world, but profoundly visible in the eyes of God. The wisest king was beginning to lose himself amidst the stone gods. This deviation not only affected the king, but threatened to corrupt the entire population. Leaders influenced the masses, and Israel, which had been called to be holy, was now facing a king who erected shrines to idols. The impact of this would reverberate for generations. The Lord, who had appeared to Solomon twice, now observed the betrayal of someone who had known his glory intimately. Solomon's estrangement from the God of Israel did not go unnoticed by heaven. The one who had been blessed with unparalleled wisdom and riches was now walking in directions opposite to the established covenant. The Lord, whose presence once filled the temple, decided to act. The divine answer came clearly and definitively. God's anger burned against Solomon. This moment marks a spiritual turning point in the kingdom, bringing to light the consequences of abandoning the Lord's commandments. God spoke to Solomon again, but now the tone was one of judgment. He declared that, because of the king's infidelity and widespread idolatry, the kingdom would be torn apart. Not in the days of Solomon, for David's sake, but in the days of his son. This decision did not annul the promises made to David, but it established a new course, the emergence of divisions, conflicts, and adversaries that would bring unrest to the kingdom that had previously enjoyed peace. The hand of the Lord, which had previously protected Solomon, now allowed his enemies to rise up. The first adversary mentioned in the scriptures is Hadad the Edomite. He had fled the massacre ordered by David in Edom when he was still a child, and later returned seeking revenge. Over time, Hadad gained power in Egypt. He married a princess and prepared to confront Israel. The Bible shows us that this enemy was raised up by God as an instrument of correction. Solomon, who had previously lived without threats, now felt the siege slowly closing in. Another who arose was Rezin son of Eliada, who had fled from his master in Zobah and had become a leader of a band of men in Damascus. Rezin became king of Syria and continued to be hostile to Israel during the last years of Solomon's reign. It was no longer just a matter of external adversaries, but of firmly established, organized enemies determined to weaken Jerusalem's dominion. The peace that characterized Solomon's reign was being replaced by tension and fear. But perhaps the most painful adversary was one from within his own household, Jeroboam. This talented young man was an officer of the king, distinguished by his administrative skills and leadership. Solomon had appointed him supervisor of the forced labor in Joseph's household. However, God sent the prophet Ahijah to announce to Jeroboam that he would receive the kingship of 10 tribes of Israel. The tunic torn into 12 pieces was the prophetic sign of the impending division. Solomon tried to kill Jeroboam, but he fled to Egypt and waited for the right moment to return. It was evident that God was undoing what had previously been established in honor. The division of the kingdom was only a matter of time. Even though Solomon remained on the throne until his death, the decline was already visible. The grandeur of Jerusalem was being eroded from within, not by foreign armies, but by the spiritual infidelity that contaminated the heart of the king and the nation. God, just in all his ways, was firmly correcting the error. The throne of Israel, which had been a symbol of justice and wisdom, was now becoming the stage for divine judgments. The Lord's anger was not impulsive or vengeful, it was a necessary response to the breaking of the covenant. The time for patience had ended, and the adversaries, like pieces on a prophetic chessboard, were moving toward the fulfillment of the word. The king was still alive, but his authority was no longer the same. In this scenario of destabilization, a new cycle was approaching. The blessings of the past could no longer contain the cracks of the present. And while the people were beginning to realize that something had changed, Solomon himself faced old age with his eyes fixed on everything he had built and everything that was beginning to crumble. With adversaries rising up on all sides and the presence of God growing ever more distant, Solomon's final years were marked by a bitter mix of past glory and present emptiness. He who had once ruled with divine wisdom now walked amidst shadows and silence. The weight of the choices made throughout his reign was beginning to fall heavily on his shoulders. There are no reports of new achievements, great victories, or momentous decisions during this period. It is merely a record of the aging of a king whose soul had become divided. Old age arrived, and with it the feeling that the splendor of the past no longer sustained inner peace. The many marriages, which previously guaranteed political alliances, now revealed their spiritual and emotional significance. Women who worshipped strange gods became companions to a weary king, and the altars he himself had ordered to be erected remained standing, witnessing their surrender to idolatry. The Bible clearly states that Solomon's heart was no longer perfect toward the Lord, as was that of his father David. During those final years, it is possible to imagine Solomon walking through the courtyards of the temple he built, perhaps reflecting on the promises made by God and the path he had taken. His wisdom had not disappeared, but now it seemed to weigh on him like a burden. The discernment that once impressed kings and queens might now only serve to discern their own ruin. The silence of the sky, which in other times was broken by revelations and dreams, had become the backdrop to his days. Despite their estrangement, God did not remove him from the throne during his lifetime, out of love for David. This detail reveals much about the Lord's faithfulness to his promises, even when men fail. Solomon still reigned, but his rule was no longer guided by the visible hand of God. The people, though still obedient, lived under the tension of impending changes. The tribes felt the weight of taxes, forced labor, and decisions made by a king who was distancing himself from the God who had crowned him. The biblical records do not provide details about Solomon's death. Unlike David, whose departure was accompanied by a final speech in an atmosphere of spiritual honor, the narrative of Solomon's end is brief. In 1 Kings 11, 41-43, we read that he rested with his ancestors and was buried in the city of David. There is no mention of reconciliation, repentance, or final prophetic words. It's as if the story ends with a question mark, leaving the reader speechless in the face of the contrast between the beginning and the end. Even without any recorded final statements, many scholars point to the book of Ecclesiastes as a possible reflection of Solomon's soul in his later years. Words like vanity of vanities, all is vanity, echo like belated confessions from a heart that has tasted everything and found emptiness. The preacher who wrote this book seems to speak with the voice of someone who had the world at his feet, but lost his essence. If Ecclesiastes is indeed a product of Solomon, it reveals a man who understood, albeit belatedly, the value of obedience and fear of the Lord. These last few years were not only the decline of a king, but the harbinger of a political and spiritual upheaval that would follow his death. Solomon ended his journey crowned with human glory, but deprived of intimacy with God. The king who began his reign offering 1,000 sacrifices to the Lord now left behind a nation divided in spirit, ready to fragment in body as well. After 40 years of reign, Solomon died. His death was not accompanied by fanfare or celestial visions, but was recorded in a sober and straightforward manner in the scriptures. The man who began his reign with humility before God and whose wisdom elevated Israel to an unprecedented level was buried in the city of David, alongside the kings who preceded him. The Bible, in 1 Kings, verse 43, states only that he rested with his ancestors. The silence surrounding this moment is eloquent, as if the sky had fallen silent before the end of someone who had strayed from their original purpose. With his death, Solomon left behind not only monumental constructions, but also a trail of social and spiritual tensions. The kingdom, though still united, was full of cracks. The burden of taxes, the exhaustion of forced laborers, the pagan altars still standing, everything indicated that the transition would not be peaceful, and indeed it was not. Rehoboam, his son, was the natural successor to the throne, but he would inherit a divided and weary people without the spiritual authority that had marked the early years of his father's reign. Rehoboam was not Solomon. Upon assuming the throne, he sought the counsel of the elders who had served his father. They suggested that by easing the burden on the people, he would win loyalty and stability. But Rehoboam disregarded the advice of the elders and preferred to listen to the young men of the court, his friends, who encouraged him to further increase the yoke on Israel. This hasty decision ignited the spark that would lead to an irreversible division. The northern tribes, led by Jeroboam, rebelled, forming a new, separate kingdom. What had been prophesied by the prophet Ahijah was now being fulfilled before everyone's eyes. The kingdom split into two. The northern kingdom, called Israel, under the rule of Jeroboam. And the southern kingdom, Judah, ruled by Rehoboam. The grandeur of a united kingdom, achieved with so much effort by David and consolidated by Solomon, was shattered by hasty decisions, pride, and a legacy of spiritual deviation. The division was not merely geopolitical, it was theological and moral. The death of Solomon, though discreetly recorded in the biblical narrative, symbolized the end of an era. The glory of Jerusalem still shone in the eyes of foreigners, but inwardly the heart of the nation was weakened. The pagan temples erected by the former king remained as visible scars of his downfall. And now, under the command of an inexperienced and inflexible son, the wounds were opening even wider. The succession had been fulfilled, but the spiritual legacy was fragile. The division of the kingdom did not happen by chance or solely due to human decisions. It was permitted by God as a judgment against Solomon's unfaithfulness. The Lord would leave Judah under the leadership of David's lineage, out of love for his faithful servant, but would allow the other tribes to follow a different path, so that the people would recognize the weight of their choices. Rehoboam received the throne, but not the same divine favor that had once rested upon his father. And this spiritual void would soon become evident. In the end, Solomon was succeeded not only by his son, but by a period of instability that would change the history of Israel forever. The unity that David had achieved with bloodshed and Solomon with wisdom was fragmented by spiritual negligence and political folly. The great empire of Israel, which had been a light to the nations, was now divided into two kingdoms with distinct destinies, both linked to the name of a king who began filled with fear but ended far from the altar he himself had erected. Even after his death, the figure of Solomon continued to resonate with subsequent generations. His name became synonymous with wisdom, power, and glory, but also with warning. The scriptures preserved not only their great achievements, such as the construction of the temple and the political height of Israel, but also their mistakes, their dangerous alliances, and their later idolatry. Solomon's legacy is a synthesis of greatness and fragility, a mirror of the human soul facing spiritual responsibility and the temptation of power. During the following centuries, kings who sat on the throne of Judah were compared to him. Some sought to follow their own paths of wisdom and justice. Others have fallen into the same errors that Solomon made. The temple he built remained the center of Israelite worship for centuries, being renovated by kings such as Hezekiah and Josiah, and finally destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar during the Babylonian captivity. Nevertheless, Solomon's name remained associated with his most sacred building. In addition to the temple, Solomon left behind a vast literary collection. Books of Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Songs are traditionally attributed to him. In Proverbs, we find the essence of practical wisdom. In songs, the poetry of love. And in Ecclesiastes, there is a melancholic reflection on the fleeting nature of life. These works reveal different phases of Solomon's heart, from vibrant youth to maturity and, finally, reflective old age. If he was the author of Ecclesiastes in a suit, then there one finds one of the most profound portraits of the soul of a king who knew everything, but forgot the essential.